All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to What the Sheet. And on today's episode, I'm actually going to show you how easy it is to change the oil on your own vehicle. So I'm going to be changing the oil on my 2012 Ram. And most people with newer cars, they just tend to take it to the dealership and have the dealership change the oil for them, and that's fine and all. For me, I think it costs about $100 for me to take it to a dealership and change oil, versus if I do it myself. I think the 6 quarts of oil and the filter costs me $50, maybe, and then just the other things I have for changing oil. Nitrile gloves just to keep my hands somewhat clean. 3/8 drive ratchet with a 1/2 inch drive socket for the oil pan. Some shop towels, kind of clean up any oil that gets on my hands or on my tools. Flashlight, just kind of help you see. And then an oil catch drum, which was like $20. So nothing too crazy expensive. So as you can see, I don't have my truck lifted up or anything because it's actually got enough room for me to get underneath. So what I'm going to kind of show you here. So there's my dipstick right there, that little yellow handle. And I change the oil every 10,000 miles or so on this, because I put in full synthetic high mileage stuff just because the truck's got 120 something thousand miles on it. And the big thing with oil changes on any vehicle is whatever oil, whether you take it to the dealership or you start doing it yourself, or either or, the big thing is to always use, or not always, it's not an always or never kind of thing. It's, you want to use the same oil as many times as you can. So for me, I've been using the Castrol GTX high mileage stuff for all of my oil changes, and that just means that in the future, every time I change the oil on this truck, I've just been doing it myself since the pandemic started, just because it's the dealership's been real hard to get into. So every time I go to get oil, I always get the same brand, same type of oil every single time. And one thing you can look for if you're not sure on what oil type to get, because there's different weights of oil. So by that, I mean there's 0W20, 0W30, 5W20, 5W30, all these different random numbers. And the best and easiest way to find this is to look on your oil cap on the engine itself, and it'll tell you what type of oil to get. So this says 5W20, and I think I grabbed, I use 5W30 just because it's a little bit better rated for winter driving. But the big thing is, as long as you're using the same oil type every single time, you should be good to go. And obviously you want to use the recommended oil for your engine, but as long as you're using the same oil, you should be good to go. And I'm sure if there's some mechanic that sees this video, he's going to tell me that I'm wrong, which is fine. I'm not a mechanic, but that's just the way kind of I was trained to do this. So obviously you want to check your dipstick in between oil changes to make sure you're not losing oil. And if you need to, you can always add a little bit here and there if you need to. So this right here, this is my oil filter. The problem is that oil filter is kind of in the middle of nowhere, and there's all this stuff in the way, which makes it a real pain in the butt to get to. And then my oil pan is right here. So right there where my light shining, that's the oil pan, and then the drain plug's on the other side. It's right here. You probably can't really see. So there's my drain plug right there, and that's just a 1/2 inch drive. So that's the only socket you need, is just to drain the oil out. And then once you do that, a lot of times, depending on how big of a oil catch you have, you can drain the oil and then drop your filter at the same time. And then while everything's kind of draining, you can kind of start preparing the new stuff. And then once you get most of the oil out of the oil pan, put your plug back in, and then put your new filter on, and then you just fill it up. It's not a super complicated process. It's just with this truck, it's a real messy process for getting at least the filter out. because if you can kind of see, everything underneath here is all kind of caked in oil, and that's just from that filter. When it comes off, it just makes a mess, and I haven't found a clean way to take it off. I have watched, there's a YouTube channel called Watch Wes Work. He's a car mechanic in, I do believe, Indiana. And he has a video where he shows a technique where he punctures the oil filter with, I don't remember what tool, it might be a screwdriver or a punch, or a steel punch. And then it drains the oil out that way. And that would probably work pretty well with, in my situation here, just to get a lot of that oil out of the filter. However, either way I do it, it still has to come out, and I basically have to angle it out this way and that way, and it still gets oil everywhere. And so I've yet to find a neat and clean way to get the oil filter off. So, okay, so now that we're out from underneath the truck, I got to put the oil catch underneath the oil pan of the truck. That way it'll catch all the oil as I'm draining it out, and then I'll let that kind of settle in. And then once that's somewhat mostly done draining, I'll put the plug back in the oil pan, slide the catch up, and then we'll take the oil filter off, get that set in here. And then once we get all that done, we'll come out, we'll get the new oil filter ready, get that put on, and then we'll start filling the truck with oil, and then we're pretty much done. This only really takes about 5-10 minutes, as long as you kind of know what you're doing. Alright, so we are underneath my truck, and as you can see, the oil cap, or the oil pan bolt is right here. Hope I got you on the camera. Yeah. And then I'm just going to use my 3/8 ratchet with the 1/2" drive. And I think that's the right way. Nope. Alright. So, slide the oil catch in front. I'm going to slide you guys back so you see what's going on. Then we'll just put the ratchet on, break this loose. Nothing should be super tight. Everything's basically hand tight with this stuff, especially the filter. So you're just going to unscrew this, and then the way I like to do it is, as I'm unscrewing it, I'm putting a little bit of pressure up to keep the bolt in, and then once I know that it's completely out, I will, as quickly as I can, drop it. And that way I don't get a lot of oil on myself. So now that the bolt's loose, what I'm going to do is just do that, and then I will set the bolt somewhere. Usually there's a spot to kind of hold it, but in this case, since my oil catch isn't big enough to do the oil pan and the filter at the same time, I'm just going to wait until this oil drains. And then once it's mostly drained out, then I'll put the filler cap, or the oil pan cap, back in, and then we'll move on to the filter. And then while this is draining, you're going to want to look at your oil, make sure it's not super dark. And in this case, it's pretty dark, but it's not super bad. And then you're going to be looking for any metal shavings or any, in this case it would be like kind of sparkly oil. That would indicate that you have some sort of issue inside the motor itself. Other things to look out for would be a really discolored oil. Looks more like milk chocolate, or like a caramely color. That would usually indicate that you have water getting into your engine oil, or air getting in there, so it'll be really bubbly. But in this case, everything's looking pretty good. It's dark, which is kind of normal once you get to about 10,000 miles on an oil change. Alright, we're going to call that good. Obviously all the oil's not out. You're never going to get all of the oil out of your oil pan unless you sit here for 20 years, and I ain't got that kind of time. So we're just gonna screw this back in, make sure it's nice and tight, grab our wrench, swip it over to tighten. Some point I'll get this on there. There we go. And then just, you know, nice and snug. Doesn't have to be super tight. Thing's not gonna go flying off anytime soon. So this is done now. One big thing that you want to look out for when you're changing oil on your vehicle is to make sure that you put your oil pan plug back in, or that bolt back in, because obviously if you forget to do it and you start dumping new oil in your engine, it's just going to go right in and right back out, and then you're going to have a huge mess if you don't have your oil catch underneath. But now that we have this done, we're going to move over to the oil filter, and I'm probably not going to be able to film that just because of how tight and cramped it is, and I don't want to get oil all over the place. So once I get that off, I'll show you how I set up the new filter, and then I'll fill the truck up, and then I'll show you how to double check your dipstick and all that stuff. Alright, so I got the old oil filter off. The rest of that is just kind of draining, and it's still sitting underneath the truck to avoid making a giant mess in my garage, which I already did. But I'm going to show you how I prep the new filter for the truck. So if I get you in here. So here's my new filter, and as you can see, there's a rubber O-ring right here, and good practice to do is to just get a little bit of the new oil, which I have right here, and I'm just going to take a little bit, splash it inside here, and then I'll take my finger and just rub it around that rubber seal, just so I get a little bit of the oil there, and then all I got to do is just thread it back on where the oil filter was, and then everything's just hand tight. So you don't need any special tool or anything like that to really reef on this and get it really on there tight, because once you put this on there and you run the engine for a little bit, with it heating up, it'll actually tighten up more, and then you're good to go. If you are having issues getting the old filter off, they do make tools that attach to your socket wrench or to your ratchet that will grip the bottom of the oil filter, and then as you go to basically loosen it, it'll grab on with some fingers and it'll help you pull it off. If for whatever reason the last guy who put it on there was like a gorilla and really put it on there tight. So take a little bit of oil, just a little bit in the filter itself, and then grab a little bit with your finger and then just run around that rubber seal, and you just want to make sure you get it all nice and covered in oil, and just kind of move that little bit of oil around. And then once you got it kind of good and coated, all you got to do now is take this over to your vehicle, whether it's your car, your truck, your van, whatever, and then just screw that back on where the old filter was, and then you can move on to topping the vehicle off with brand new oil. Alright, so we got the new filter put on, and now we are ready to actually fill the truck up with the new oil. And in my case, I need 6 quarts, and I just found that information out by reading the owner's manual. And that's kind of going to be the case for most vehicles. If you're not sure how much oil you need, if you want to do it yourself, so like for example, my wife's car, her Kia Optima, that only takes 5 quarts, and my old car, my old Camry, that was the same way. It took only 5 quarts for an engine oil change. So just read your owner's manual if you want to do this yourself. At some point somewhere in there, it'll tell you on oil changes, it'll tell you what filter you need and the amount of engine oil you need to when you change it out. And if you're not sure, you could always buy, let's say you wanted to do this on a regular basis, you could buy a couple of the bigger jugs, which are 5 quarts each, and then put one in, and then check your oil using your dipstick, which is this guy down here, after it settles for a little bit. And then if you need more, just add a little, about a quart at a time, and you can figure it out that way. Then you just write it down so you know for later. But In my case, I know I need 6. I've done this a few times already, so I know exactly how much oil I need. I don't need to check it as I'm filling. So what I'm going to do is use my funnel, and I'm just going to pour this in. I'm not just going to dump it in, because sometimes you can have some spill out over the side of the fill part on the truck or in your car, or on your filter, on your funnel itself. You could overflow the funnel. So we'll pour our single quart in, get that out of the way, get as much of it in as you can. And then I always like to put the caps on the, even on the empties, just in case it gets knocked over, or I don't want to, or I just don't want to lose the cap at the same time. So take the big guy, got that done. Or what I mean by got that done, there's a foil seal on these bigger jugs, so you can usually just use your thumb or your finger and just puncture a hole in it, and then depending on how well or where it broke, I usually just use my finger and just kind of ream it around on the inside edge. And there's a few techniques on pouring oil from a larger jug like this. Most guys will have you pour it, kind of go this way. So sometimes you'll want to pour it with the oil coming out this side. So you want basically the handle side down or sideways. And the main purpose of that is if you pour it like this, a lot of times you'll get the kind of lug of the oil coming out. And that's just because the oil is filling up the whole place and there's an air gap, and then it will kind of pulsate back and forth. So if you pour slow, you don't have the problem. Or if you pour in a different direction, you run less of a risk of the oil kind of shooting out as you're pouring. And so it's kind of whatever you're more comfortable with. I drive truck, so I'm used to filling up out of a big jug like this, and I typically pour sideways. So I'll tip it sideways and just pour it slowly that way. And then once I get towards the end, I'll rotate it and then pour it like you would a normal, gallon of milk or whatever, just so I can get that last bit of oil to come out on the smooth side here. So, kind of show you what I mean. So as I'm pouring, hope you guys can kind of see what I'm doing. So I'm going to pour it sideways. And like I did with the smaller jug, I'm going to go slow, so that way I can kind of maintain control, and I want to be looking inside the filter or the funnel to make sure that I'm not filling it up too fast to where it's going to overflow or tip out. Alright, so we're going to pull the funnel out, just kind of tap it a little bit, get any of that residual oil off, and then set that like so. Put this on. So you always want to make sure that you're putting all your caps and covers back on before you move on to the next step, because otherwise you could forget about it. And especially with the oil filler cap on the top, if you forget to do that, when you're driving, you can actually have oil shoot out the top of your engine compartment, and you can lose oil that way, and then you have a huge mess on the inside of your engine compartment, and then you're losing all that oil that you need for the engine itself. So now that we got the new oil in, you want to always double check underneath, make sure you're not having any leaks, either from the oil pan or the oil filter, or if you have a crack in your oil pan or something like that, you want to double check for any leaks of old or new oil. And then I like to let everything kind of settle in for a couple minutes just to make sure it's all down, and then I'm going to check the actual dipstick of the oil itself. Alright, so we've let things settle enough to where I feel comfortable checking the oil. So we're going to pull the dipstick out, and we're just going to wipe it right away. We're not going to bother checking it because there's going to be oil kind of all over the place. So you just want to wipe it clean. And then when you're going to put it back in somewheres, so let's see if I can get you to kind of see what's going on here. Might be a little too bright. There we go. So you can kind of see a little bit of a hash right there. So on that hash mark, the dipstick's upside down, but on the end, let's see if I get my finger in there. So right there, it'll say add. So if you check your oil and it's below that hash, you're gonna want to add, at least a quart of oil. And then at the top, that means you're full. So anything over that, more than likely your engine will start to burn oil because you'll have too much in the system, and you'll just see some white smoke coming out until you get down to where the engine's comfortable running with the oil you have. So it's not the end of the world if you have too much oil in there. Just know that you're going to have some smelly exhaust for a while until that gets fixed. So we're looking for the oil to be somewhere kind of in the middle of this hashed area right here. Like I said, the add mark is right here at the end. It'll tell you add. So at the bottom of that hash means you need to add oil. At the top of the hash means you're full. So I'm going to stick this back in, and hopefully we'll end up somewhere on that hash mark area. And then when I wipe it and stick it back in, I like to let it sit for a few seconds before I pull it back out. That way I know I'm getting a good reading. And you can kind of see the bubble of the oil right there, so it's almost right center on that hash marked area, which means we are good to go. And I already checked underneath the truck. We're not losing any oil, which is good. So the next step with an oil change that I like to do is I'll run the vehicle for a couple minutes before I do any major driving. So like in this case today, I've got to go in town to get some parts for another little project I'm working on. And so what I'll do is I'll pull the truck out of the garage, let it idle for a few minutes, kind of let the new oil circulate around, and then that way I can kind of double check, make sure there's no leaks underneath. Because sometimes with running the oil, the filter might come loose or the oil pan bolt might have backed off a little bit. So it's always good to just let it idle. And in the meantime, you can be checking all the other fluids. So, your brake fluid, power steering fluid, your washer fluid, your transmission. Just kind of do a once over your vehicle. You could check your air filters and just kind of do a good once over your vehicle. Walk around, check your tire pressure. If you don't have a tire pressure monitoring system. And yeah, so that's going to be about it for today's video on the oil change. If you have any questions or have maybe any advice on better ways that I could change the oil, especially with the filter process, because it just makes a huge mess no matter what I do, be sure to drop down in the comments below. And if you want me to show you the oil change on my wife's car, her Kia, that one goes a lot smoother and almost zero mess, which is awesome. But yeah, that's going to conclude today's video, so I will catch you in the next one. Peace out.